is atheism a form of faith? In order to answer this question, it's helpful to start from a much more fundamental place, which is, what does it mean to believe in something, have faith in something, and what does it mean to be religious? Now, descriptively, religion or religio simply is a set of beliefs and practices. The whole idea of religio is something that guides or is a practice that is common to a number of adherents that has a certain worldview underpinning it. And again, that worldview, from the bare descriptive point, the religio, is not necessarily spiritual in nature. One can have a religio, a set of beliefs and practices about a number of things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the spiritual life. Although, in the language of religio, it is one thing that encompasses the spiritual life for sure. Now, if we think about that from a descriptive point of view, what does it mean to have faith in something then? Well, faith or belief in something that is often attributed to the religious in the spiritual sense, is a faith that has a certain level of doctrine and dogma to it. Now, dogma are the required sets of beliefs within a certain religio. The dogma of certain faiths means that you must believe or think this way in order to be one of those religio observant people. So in other words, it would make complete sense for me to talk about religio, a set of beliefs and practices, as it comes to martial arts. When one is a practitioner of a certain style of martial arts, let's say Taekwondo, like I am, I not only practice that in my outward body, I not only do the motions and the things that are necessary, but I also take on a certain mindset, a certain set of beliefs and practices when I come to practice that particular part of my life. Now, Taekwondo and many martial arts, in fact, I think almost universally, the martial arts that we have that come from China, from Japan, they have an intense religious element to it. In fact, it's hard to differentiate the two from the practice, from the belief, things like that. There's a significant amount of religious spiritual practice that goes into Taekwondo, goes into these sorts of martial arts, Kung Fu and Karate and things like that. But when we talk about atheism, atheism is the belief that there is no God. Now, as Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale point out, sometimes we treat atheism as sort of a blanket term that sort of encompasses agnosticism as well. Agnosticism is the position that I simply do not know if there is a God or not. It's a skeptical position, whereas atheism is a dogmatic position. There is no God. Whereas our skeptics in the agnostic camp would sometimes not want to be associated with the atheistic camp. And there are examples of people who much rather prefer agnostic because it's more descriptive of their position. I'm just not sure if there's a God or not. And from the philosophical standpoint, these are significantly different points of view. Skepticism and atheism is not necessarily oil and water. The two can go together. But skepticism is not the same thing as having a dogmatic point of view about, let's say, if there's a God or not. There can be some dogmatism in other ways because skepticism and agnosticism usually goes in line with relativism, where relativism in the idea that there are no absolute moral realities in the world. But to get back to the point, is atheism a faith? Yes and no. When we use faith colloquially, we have to at least be honest with ourselves that when we talk about faith, we're usually not talking about those who are holding that there is no God. However, it also is appropriate in some cases. The good example that I think Beale brings up in this chapter is that whenever you get someone that says the following, there is no evidence for God, realize that you're dealing with someone who ascribes to the faith that comes with a certain kind of atheism. In other words, it's, and Bertrand Russell, by the way, who was a very, very hardline atheist of the 20th century, Russell, I think, more appropriately says that there is no tight argumentative proof that there is not a God, but rather, as Russell famously said, if God exists, he can tell me when I die. Russell leaves that part open because Russell is a good atheist in this case. He is good in this case because he knows that argumentatively, whenever someone says there is an indefensible position, there is no evidence for the contrary, he as a philosopher knows that's an indefensible position. The whole point of philosophy is that there are all kinds of evidences we have to weigh against each other. And for someone to claim just carte blanche that there's no evidence for something whatsoever, that is a sign of either someone not knowing their position, or number two, someone misunderstanding what exactly will count as evidence or not. So Bertrand Russell would disagree with even the hardline atheists of today that would say that there is no evidence for God. Russell would say, no, that's not how we need to treat this. Russell, of course, was a staunch atheist. So we can take a little bit of cues from Bertrand Russell, who was a very accomplished philosopher too. But when we talk about atheism as being a faith, it's more helpful, I think, to talk about atheism as akin to a religion. Because religio is a set of beliefs and practices. And it can morph into one of those sort of dogmatic sorts of religions whenever you run across someone who simply dismisses any idea that there can be evidence for God in any way, shape, or form. It's sort of like, and this is perhaps a little bit controversial for me to say, but I think it's philosophically tight. It's sort of like those from the theistic side saying that there is no evidence for atheism. That also is a little bit too far there. It's not that there's no evidence for atheism, it's how we're weighing the evidence. And what are our underlying convictions? Every single position within philosophy, theology, or otherwise is a faith-based position. Because we are putting our faith in, we are putting our a priori selves into what we think is the best explanation for the world. And in doing that, we can do that both in the theistic and atheistic sense. Sigmund Freud claims that we see everything through the tinted glass of perception. I feel that he carries this concept to extremes by implying that our wish faculties will always exceed our desire to see truth clearly and annihilate it. I'd like to hear Dr. Polkinghorne or you rescue us from this dilemma of perception in our quest for pure knowing, less relative to science than to theology and psychology. When the question asker brings up Sigmund Freud's argument of perception, it's helpful for us, once again, to take a step back before we get into the question. When Sigmund Freud talks about perception, and likewise when we philosophically talk about our perceiving of the physical world, what Freud, from a psychological standpoint, is saying is basically that the lens of which we are viewing something through is something that fundamentally changes the way that we see the world. And the lenses, psychologically, that we wear in front of our eyes, to use the analogy of wearing tinted glasses, those tinted glasses color everything we see in the world, such that we are not perceiving what we would say is the actual reality of what is there. Even if I'm simply wearing red tinted glasses, I would look over there and see something that is, oh, that looks red. But of course, if we are aware that we're wearing red tinted glasses, we would be able to have some suspicion of our own perception. No, that's not red. It has to do with what I'm wearing right now. I need to remove what I'm wearing in order to see it more clearly. The problem with this, though, is that how can you remove the glasses of your own perception? The answer is you cannot do so, which is why Freud was so strong on having to become aware of your sort of inner tendencies. But this runs into a problem. Freud and other thinkers that would point to perhaps internal psychological or external structures that cause us to see the world relativistically. Freud would be one, Marx would be the other, in which either your perception is blurred by your own internal workings of your psychology, or it is blurred by the external class system of the rest of how society is functioning, or how society is structured. Now, the thing is, though, is that if you read Freud and if you read Marx, you'll notice that there is one conspicuous person that is left out of their summary as to how you fix this problem, which is their own self. The unfortunate thing that happens whenever we try to drill down to how do I have an objective perspective on something is you then have to ask who is truly objective. Now, you can go the skeptical route and say that nothing is objective, not even myself, and therefore everything that I'm perceiving right now is simply an experience of the phenomena rather than an actual truth of the phenomena. I can experience, let's say, the handling of this book. I can hold it in my hands and put it down, and I am experiencing the book. But do I really experience in a true way the book? Or is it simply what my fingers are telling my brain? The rabbit hole goes very deep on this. But what Polkinghorne comes back and says, and Beale comes back and says this too, is there is a counter to this sort of physical relativism that you get in Freud, Marx, and others that have sort of expanded the field. And there is a significantly powerful philosophical position that became fairly prominent recently, which is something called critical realism. Now, don't let that scare you. Basically, what this is trying to say is that there is a critical, realistic experience of the world in which we are both saying that there are ways in which we experience the world that will simply never be able to be objective in its truth. The even experience of color, those tinted glasses, when I look at something that's green, I can know that that is green, but when I ask someone else if it's green, of course they'll say it's green. But the thing is, though, is that their experience of the color green and the experience of greenness in and of itself, that becomes a whole lot more complicated when we are asking if we're seeing the same green. There are shades and hues of green that can actually be measured using particular instruments that can measure the wavelength that something bounces back at it, because all light is simply a wave that's being flashed back into our eyes. I am simply seeing the wavelength that is assigned to the certain color. But the thing is that my perception of that wavelength is, in a lot of ways, experiential. I can say that that's green, but if you ask me what the exact color of green that is, you're going to get answers all over the map from different people. And if you have someone who's red-green colorblind, they're not going to say it's green at all. So the problem is that that doesn't necessarily have to do with with the truth of the world only merely. It also has to do with my experience and perception of it. It's both of these things, and what critical realism is going to say is that between these two bits of data and other data that we can gather, we can make a probabilistic argument as to what the truth of the matter is. We can make a probabilistic argument that is fairly airtight, that holds to be true for a significant bit of the data that we are holding, but we can also say, at least at the end of the day, that these are simply models for how we are modeling the world. Every single thing that we do in science is a measurement of the physical universe, but that measurement is based off of other bits of data and phenomena that we have to base our baselines off of. That machine that measures the wavelength of light and things like that, whenever the machine is measuring that wavelength, it is spitting back numbers in your face. It's not telling you, like, oh, that's hunter green, or oh, that's lime green. That's not what the machine is doing. It's spitting back numbers at you, and those numbers have to be interpreted. And the interpretation of those data is what we use to build a probable picture of what really is going on in the world. And in that way, our perception, of course, plays a big role in that. Freud was really helpful in pointing out how deeply our perceptions can color the way we see the world. However, to push back on a purely relativist sort of way of talking about this, instead of saying that, no, the world is only my perception of it, instead what a critical realist will say is that, no, the world is real. There is a realness to the world. We can measure the world in a real way that is reliable. And of course, critical realism takes in a whole bunch of interdisciplinary sort of approach to this, which is that they take in philosophy and science and theology and psychology and history. That's what critical realism is. It's a very broad interdisciplinary approach. And from that, we say the world is real. We really are measuring something that's real. But our perception of what that means for us is something we really have to take into account. Again, this gets back to the earlier question, is atheism a faith? The more appropriate question is, what sorts of beliefs and practices does atheism purport to hold the world more truly in than someone who is a theist? And what evidences do they put forth? What's their argument? On the theistic side, what evidences do they put forth? What's the argument? And then weighing between these things is where we have to then use our experience and our perception to make an approximate judgment about that. It's not that the world is fake, and it's not that our perception is fake. It's both of them are real. But the real reality to the situation is beyond simply my perception or experience of it. Where in relation to the Bible does story end and history begin? And how can we tell the difference? I agree with John Polkinghorne about the nature of the creation stories in Genesis. Surely those narratives disclose foundational truths in the manner of, say, poetry or song. My question, however, concerns the dividing line biblical apologists draw between the first 11 chapters of Genesis and the supposedly historical accounts from Abraham onwards, including the gospel traditions regarding Jesus. Many of the biblical stories are replete with delightful puns and allusions, yet they are embedded in texts that purport to be chronicles of Israel's history. If we convert the transfiguration to some sort of elaborate metaphor, why should we not feel compelled to do the same to the resurrection? One of the keys to biblical interpretation is knowing what you're reading. When we talk about the Bible, it's often the case where we treat the Bible as if it is one single book that has chapters in it. Except that the Bible itself makes fairly clear that it is not something that contains chapters, but contains books. And in fact, the word Biblia, the word Bible itself, means the books. It's a plural word. Bible is plural, not singular, even though we often use it in the singular sense. Biblio is books, it's library, really in the Latin sense. It is a library of resources. Now, in a library, you have different sections of that library. You have the fiction section. You have the historical section. You have the historical fiction section. You have the historical real section. You have different subcategories even within that. And of course, you have the poetry section. You have the action section. You have all kinds of different ways in which the library is divvied up into different sections, and you would not expect all of those sections to have the same way that you read them. You would not read the poetry of Robert Frost in the same way that you read a textbook about the history of the American Civil War. Those two are doing completely different things, and they come from completely different perspectives. Both of them are trying to do something true in the world, but neither one of them are the same, and neither one of them even are remotely the same genre. When we talk about the Bible, we have to be able to remember that within the scriptures themselves are multiple different genres, and it's not just between books. Every book itself is replete with different sorts of genre. And in fact, they even tell you that if you read them close enough. When you read some of the history of the Kings and Chronicles of Israel, there are places in the Chronicles where all of a sudden it turns into a letter. It says, this king sent this letter to this people, and this is what the letter said. All of a sudden, in the middle of this historical section, you have a reference to a letter that was sent, and it changes its genre completely. Letters are not the same thing as the annals of the kings. Letters on an occasional basis are not the same sort of thing as covering the highlights of a monarch's rule. So it changes even within the books themselves often. The thing that we have to be careful about, though, is this question asker appropriately says, okay, the first 11 chapters of Genesis that deal with the beginning of the world and so on and so forth, well, we're reading them as story. Well, where does the line between story and real account begin? Now, literarily, just from a literary standpoint, that's not something that's easily determined, because you have to take the text on its own basis when you're looking at it from a purely literary standpoint. You're not asking the question of which part of this is real and which part of this is not, because from a literary standpoint, it's real because it's in front of you. It's sort of like asking, again, whether Robert Frost's poetry is real or not. No, Robert Frost's poetry is real because it's in front of me and I'm reading it. The question of the literary critic, the literary scholar, is rather, what purpose is this particular part of this literary canon serving over the long arc of the book itself? When we read Genesis, the literary scholar and critic is going to say, what is going on in the first 11 parts, or the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, and not, is the first 11 chapters of Genesis real or not? That's not the question that a literary critic would ask. Rather, what is the point of the book itself? Now, let's change gears a little bit, okay? From a historical perspective, we then are asking ourselves, how does this literary work correspond or not with reality in the world? So from a historical critical standpoint, you're asking, how does this relate to reality? To use the example in here, whenever Robert Burns writes the wonderful poem, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, which he's referring to someone who's real. He's referring to the person of whom he loves. When he says that my love, my love, is like a red, red rose, he's not meaning that his beloved is made of flower material and has prickles, to use a Polkinghorne's kind of funny point here. He's not calling the person a flower. He's using some complex language. My love is like a red, red rose, newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that sweetly played in tune, to use the other part of that piece of poetry. The person is neither a flower nor is a piece of music. We are using some fairly advanced sorts of imagery to talk about something that's way too big for just words on a page. When we think about the Genesis accounts, this is the, I think, solid argument that those within Polkinghorne and Beale's position are making. The truth of the Genesis accounts is not whether they're real or not. That's not what we're asking here, neither from the historical perspective nor from the literary perspective. Rather, what we're asking is, what purpose are these things showing us? It's one thing to say that God literally created things in a certain fashion. And it's another thing to say that the poetry of the early portions of Genesis are trying to tell us that God's the creator and not anything else. Both of these things are true in both of these perspectives, whether you take a literal perspective or not. The point is, and again, the point of the story is, in Polkinghorne and Beale's argument, is the bigger picture, not the minute picture. Because, as they've said before, and others will say kind of obviously, the Bible is not a scientific textbook. The Bible is the story of God's interaction with the people of Israel, and particularly in his revelation to the world in the person of Jesus Christ. So, what part of the Bible is true? Where is the line between story and truth? That's sort of a false question, especially when you ask someone who is a literary scholar. It's not necessarily where the line of truth falls. It rather is where the line between what is the most important truth that is being told here. Now, let's deal with a different issue, though, because it's one thing to talk about the poetry of Genesis. It is another thing when we talk about the Gospels. So, whenever he's talking about the metaphor of the ascension, it was it probably is still very popular in some circles to make metaphors out of the ascension of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and so on and so forth, in a non-real fashion. Now, again, the non-real fashion is not in the literary sense, it is in the historical sense. In other words, what does resurrection mean for me? However, the problem we run into that is that the Gospels very clearly are not poetry. The Gospels use all kinds of poetry. The Gospels use all kinds of different genres within them. But the Gospels very, very clearly are trying to be an actual account of the happenings in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, particularly through the lens of what happens in his earthly ministry, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ascension into heaven. Those four things are contained in every single gospel account from different kaleidoscopic perspectives in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the thing is that when we treat those gospel accounts as that's a nice story, we also commit the same issue that we do when we read Genesis chapters 1 through 11, which is that we get the genre wrong. If we get the genre wrong, we then run into a significant problem, which is that we don't know how to read it. If we read the accounts of the resurrection as metaphor and poetry, we have lost the actual genre that we're reading. The genre of the Gospels is not poetry. It is account, and it is historical account. And as the Gospels themselves make very clear at the very beginnings of their writing, St. Mark's Gospel says, this is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, and then starts with a historical happening. Here comes John the Baptist, a historical person. Here comes Jesus, a historical person. Here goes Jesus to his trial, a historical happening. During the time of Pontius Pilate, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, during the time of Tiberius Caesar, the Gospels themselves make fairly clear they're telling a historical account. So we don't need to make either of these errors. We don't need to make the error of reading poetry as if it is account, and we don't need to make the mistake of reading account as if it is poetry. We then have to take seriously the arguments of an account, and we then have to weigh that against the evidences that we have of that account's realness or not. How does the death of Jesus save the world? The mechanics of salvation is something that Christians have, number one, never been fully on the same page in any singular theory about. But number two, how does Jesus' death save the world is also a question at which the latter letters of the New Testament of St. Paul and St. Peter and others also provide differences between their treatment of it. St. Paul, by the way, doesn't have one single theory as to how Jesus' death saves the world. He has a number of different theories that he puts out there. Just to name a few, there is the substitution theory of Jesus takes our place. There is what's called the recapitulation theory, in which Jesus undoes what Adam did by redoing it the right way. He's recapitulating an act of Adam that was done wrong in the first place. So by Jesus's living and his death and resurrection, he has undone the sin of Adam. To use Paul's own language, whereas by one man sin entered the world, by one man sin has been removed. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. It's a comparison contrast that Jesus undoes and redoes in the right way what Adam couldn't do. That's another theory right there. One of the other theories is that the Christus Victor theory, where Christ victoriously wins the battle over sin, death, and hell. We were captors being captured by sin and death, and we had no way of freeing ourselves, and Christ the victor comes in to overturn death by his death, another Pauline word, Pauline phrase here, overturns death by his own death, and therefore raises us in a resurrection in the same manner as his resurrection. So there is the victor side of here, but then there's also the ransom theory, where Jesus paid our ransom that we might go free. And of course, Jesus himself says, I have not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. But again, there are all kinds of theories out there as to how does Jesus' death save the world? Or more appropriately, what I would say is, how does Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension save the world? All of those things are of a piece. But there's not one single theory that Christians will kind of fall back on. However, what is certainly the case is that in the action of Christ on our behalf, Jesus accomplished that which we could not accomplish. And he did that by the sacrificial death of himself on the cross, his raising in a bodily resurrection, his ascending into heaven, a foretaste of our ascension into God, and that Christ still reigns from on high and is still not only accessible, but active in the world through his body, the church. So, how does Jesus' death save the world? In all of those ways. Why believe Jesus rose from the dead? There are two ways you can take this question. There is the why believe Jesus rose from the dead, the whole idea of, well, what evidence do you have to believe that? And there's also the second question of meaning, why believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Like, why is that important in the first place? So, both of these questions have similar roots to them. Why? Why believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, we'd say that the evidence supports it. That is, again, sort of a shorthand way of saying that there is a whole class over how do we believe this. And in fact, if you're watching this here in 2023, I highly encourage you, if you want a robust answer to this question, go back and watch our series over N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope. N.T. Wright lays out exhaustively, and not even as exhaustively as he does in other places, but lays out significant layers as to why Christians can, from the historical realist standpoint, say with confidence that the evidence points to Jesus' bodily resurrection. I'll point you there for a better discussion of this. But I want to deal with maybe a more important question, which is that second one. Why is it important that we believe in Jesus' resurrection? Well, in other words, why can't Jesus simply be important just on his own? Why do we have to tack on the resurrection, perhaps as this question sort of supposes? Well, the resurrection is the culmination of the hope that we all have in the end. And it's not simply that we are hoping against hope, that we're crossing our fingers real hard and really hoping that this will happen. But as a letter in the New Testament would say, we have the sure and certain hope of that resurrection because Jesus has gone before us. And that Jesus' resurrection in history, and this is something that Polkinghorne, Beale, and N.T. Wright as well make a big point of, Jesus' resurrection in history, within human history, is something that is a sure and certain foretaste in a realistic sense that is what awaits us in our destiny for those who are in Christ. That this is a joyful hope that we have to look forward to, surely to look forward to, and that we're not left biting our fingernails in nervousness, hoping that something will happen at the end, but rather that because Jesus was really a person, really became one of us, was really God, really died, really raised in a resurrection of the body, and really ascended, we are given even over and above the pie-in-the-sky dream, but we're actually given the physical assurance that this really is what the hope and the joy of the resurrection will be for those who then pass beyond this mortal life.